Thank you, Laurie, and good evening. I'm speaking to you from our new Tozer Ecosystem Science building at the Cary Institute. So for those of you who have been here before, and I'm waiting to see the poll results, but usually it's about half of you are new to our programming. I think tonight we'll have more old friends for the Ames lecture. But I apologize that Amy and Rosie are not joining me tonight. I know that many people sign on just for the entertainment of watching my dogs. Anyway, let me just say something about Ned Ames, who I think is going to be on this webinar watching. Ned was the man who, with Gene Likens, founded Cary Institute in 1983. As the managing trustee of the Mary Flagler Cary Charitable Trust, which I will just call the Trust for short, Ned stewarded Mrs. Cary's legacy, including the property that our headquarters and our 2,000 acres of research forest now sits. Ned did that from her death in the late 60s through an ownership of the New York Botanical Gardens to the Institute of Ecosystem Studies, following up on the Cary Arboretum, which the New York Botanical Gardens initially tried on this property, but we ended up as the Institute for Ecosystem Studies in 1983. And I'm just looking. 38%. That's a little lower than usual, but still wonderful. Thank you all for coming. Anyway, so Ned really was the steward of this property, and he also remarkably ensured our financial security, as we were one of the trust beneficiaries when it was dissolved in 2008, and the gift formed the corpus of our endowment in 2009, which was a great time to get into the stock market. So Ned really had the vision. He is a great visionary of many things, including helping found lots of environmental organizations. So I will leave it at that. An anonymous donor made a gift to fund these lectures, and this is our 12th, which when Laurie Quillen and I looked up the numbers, Laurie looked up who had done it before, and she said, I can't believe it would have been our 13th, but having to cancel last year. The inaugural lecture was given by founding trustee, the recently late Thomas E. Lovejoy III. Tom was a trustee for decades and was a remarkable ecologist, advocate for the environment, the sort of dean of Amazon ecology, and we will miss him greatly. The second lecture was given by Francis Beinecke, who was then, I'm not going to go through all 12, I promise, who was then the head of NRDC and is now a Cary trustee as well. Bill Schlesinger and Gene Likens, as presidents of Cary Institute, have given previous lectures, and therefore we're trustees, although non-voting trustees of Cary Institute. So a third of our lectures have been by trustees. And it is with great joy that I am pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Emily Bernhardt. She is a Cary trustee. You saw where I was heading with that. And she's chair of Cary's Science Advisory Committee of the board. But Emily is also an ecosystem ecologist and the James B. Duke Professor of Ecology at Duke University. She's a biogeochemist and co-authored with Cary's second president, Bill Schlesinger, the textbook on the subject biogeochemistry. She and Emma Rossi steward the 59-year data set on acid rain deposition at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest that was begun by Cary's founder, Gene Likens. So Emily has long and deep connections to Cary Institute, past, present, and I hope future. And it is with great joy, again, I say, that I turn over to Emily and say, Emily, welcome, and thank you for joining us for the 13th Ned Ames lecture.
Thanks so much, Josh, and thanks to all of you who are sharing what I was going to say is Friday night, but looking at the chat, clearly a wide variety of times from all over the world. And I think that's a great silver lining. I really regret that this now thrice delayed lecture is happening remotely, but it is really lovely to see people from all over the place tuning in to talk about an issue that I think is becoming an increasingly prevalent concern to all of us who live on, near, or love visiting the coast. So let me get started in sharing my screen. We're going to do things a little bit differently because Zoom lectures of people talking at you for 50 minutes can be a hard, especially at this time of night for me. So I'm going to give a few slides. We're going to watch a really beautiful video, documentary of some of our work that was done by Luke Groskin from Science Friday. And then Josh and I are going to have a conversation that includes Josh's questions for me, but also questions from the audience. So I hope this will be a little bit more fun than your average lecture. So we're doing some active learning here, right, Josh? All right, so just making sure you can see my slides, Josh. Can you give me a thumbs up? Oh, and I just realized, you know what? I'm going to stop and share again because I did not make sure the video will work. Yep, we're good. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
We see everything. At
Okay.
least I can, but people can just quickly say in the chat if they can see things.
All right. Well, great. So I think behind me in my my display, my video background, and here on the title slide, we're looking at a ghost forest. These are becoming increasingly prevalent features of the coastal plains of North America, and many of you may have seen them during your travels or your lives in the coastal plain. Before I get started talking about this, I want to make sure that like all good ecosystem ecologists, almost all of our work is done in large teams. It really does take a village to study complex problems at scale. And so I just want to acknowledge that everything I'll talk about today arises from the great work of my collaborators, and any mistakes that I make, I will own myself. And I also want to thank our funding organizations for making this work possible. One of the most important points I'd like to make when I talk about climate change on the coastal plain is that it's not something that we need to talk about happening in the future. We don't have to wait. We are already facing really rapid climate change induced shifts in our ecosystems. This is a map from the NOAA Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper. It's not a projection. It's actually showing you in red those areas that are already subject to tidal flooding, often called recurrent or nuisance flooding. And I think you can see there's a lot of red there across our coastal plain, both the and I'm going to use North American Coastal Plain, or NACP. I'm really talking about the entire Eastern Atlantic coast as well as the Gulf Coast. And so this is a problem that we don't have to wait for. And you can see that some areas have really big bullseye of red. I happen to live near and work in one of those bullseyes on the coast of North Carolina. You also see that in the southern part of South Carolina, and of course in the Louisiana coast. These are areas where you're seeing a really large areas that are prone to this coastal flooding. If I zoom in on sort of my favorite part of the coastline, this is the coastline of North Carolina. If you've been there, you'll note the Outer Banks there, that little strip of land. We've got the Albemarle-Pamlico sounds there in between the Outer Banks and the mainland. And here, this is a different map, which is just showing you how much of this area is flooded during a Category 1 hurricane. And what about a Category 5 hurricane? You can see that there's a tremendous amount of land that is subject to flooding during hurricanes. So the previous graph was, regular sort of high tide flooding. This is showing you what happens during a hurricane. This is a really low topography landscape. Mountains in this landscape are going to be, 3 to 5 meters above sea level. And so we really are looking at a landscape where there's a lot of connection to the sea, even on what is dry, or I might say soggy land. It's also the entire Eastern and Gulf Coast are subjected to pretty significant disturbances through hurricanes that are really significant events that can bring saltwater inland. And that's certainly one way in which we see saltwater intrusion occurring. I'm just going to show you one piece of data from my colleague Ryan Emanuel here at the southern end of this, what we call the Pamlico Albemarle Peninsula. This is from the Goose Creek State Park. It was a freshwater wetland that was above a levee. Hurricane Irene came in, dumped a huge amount of storm surge salt water into this freshwater wetland. And the graph on the bottom shows in blue the salinity of that freshwater wetland following Hurricane Irene. Water level doesn't really change, and it takes more than a year for rain to rinse out these salts. So one of the ways that salt water moves inland from the coast is in these dramatic events like hurricanes. The other thing that we see happening in much of our coastal plain, like we see around the world, is increasingly severe or long duration droughts. And we had such a drought on the coast of North Carolina between 2007 and 2012, punctuated by Hurricane Irene. So in red here, I'm just showing you the Palmer Drought Severity Index for that period of time. You can see we had 3 years of drought with a hurricane in between. That's a pretty tough time to live as a tree. And drought in a really flat landscape is another way in which saltwater from the sea can move upland or inland or landward. This is data from now the northern part of the peninsula and a big restoration project we were working on that shows on the bottom graph in the The data points are salinity. The gray points in the back of that are the water level. And so this is a restoration project. It had been an agricultural landscape, was converted back into a wetland. It's the largest wetland restoration project east of the Mississippi. It's about 5 kilometers from the nearest coastline, and it had been actively drained. And so once they reconnected it to the canal system, removed the pump station, we started to see during these periods of drought, brackish water entering this restoration wetland. A lot of trees that were planted as part of this restoration project died as a result of the drought and salinization. So drought is another way we can see salt waters moving up gradient, made more possible in this kind of system because of all the canals and ditches that are made to move water off the landscape, but also serve to bring it in. You'll see this point reiterated in the video ahead. And so part of what makes the coastal plain of North Carolina and many other really flat landscapes particularly vulnerable to saltwater intrusion is this extreme hyperconnectivity. This is the graph of a map of the same place. All those gray lines, those aren't roads, those are drainage ditches and canals. So this is a system of drainage that was put in place to make it possible to farm what was a very soggy landscape. And as people, either because of restoration or because of farm abandonment, stop actively maintaining this drainage, it becomes a route for salts to move upland. So it's not going to be surprising to anyone who's thought at all about sea level rise that you're going to see an erosion at the margins as the sea overtakes the land. These are some pictures around the coast of North Carolina where you see these stranded cypress stumps 20 to 30 meters out in the sound. And that's sort of the sea eating away at our coastal plain fringes. And so there's just a couple of pictures of some of the sites that we work in, where we start to see stranded dying stumps and then ghost forest where it's not covered by the sea. But we also see ghost forests pretty far inland. So this is actually along the Intracoastal Waterway, many kilometers away from the coastline, but made coastal as a result of hydrologic alterations that are intended for navigation, but also serve to make a pathway by which salts can move inland. So we see this penetration of salinization much farther inland than you would expect without the hydrologic alterations that humans have done. And this is going to be true to differing degrees throughout the North American coastal plain. So if a picture is better than 1,000 words, a really good short documentary is worth, I don't know, 100,000. So I'm going to now take a break from talking to you and let us watch about a 10-minute video that was prepared by Luke Groskin, who's an award-winning documentary filmmaker who was working with Science Friday for the last several years. He spent 3 days with us down on the North Atlantic coast and made the video that we're about to watch together. If I can find my cursor. There we go. A ghost forest is a very clever name for a kind of unfortunate new habitat type we're seeing growing on the coast. And it's a place where you have a lot of dead trees, large areas of contiguous forest that are just gone.
My emotional response is to mourn the loss of those trees. But scientifically, I say, what was the combination of stresses that caused this particular stand of trees to bite the dust?
We've been doing this now for close to a decade, and in that time, we've already been seeing changes. If these things are changing on a timescale where I can see it, what's going to happen for this landscape, by the time my kids grow up? My name is Marcelo Ardone, and I study ecosystem ecology and biogeochemistry of streams and wetlands.
And I'm Emily Bernhardt, and I am a biogeochemist and aquatic ecologist.
And I'm Ryan Emanuel, and I'm a hydrologist.
Believe it or not, back in 2004, this was a really large 440-acre farm that was purchased by a group of developers who decided to turn it into a wetland. Because we were studying this wetland restoration project, it didn't even occur to us that saltwater would get here. And we recognized a year after the first intrusion event happened that we had gotten to near brackish conditions in much of this wetland.
And that's what kind of led us into this research of saltwater intrusion and trying to understand if the patterns we had seen in this restored wetland were also happening in the broader area of the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula.
The Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula is a landscape that's dominated by water.
So we have the Pamlico Sound in the south and the Albemarle Sound in the north. We have the big Alligator River sort of cutting down through the middle of this peninsula.
Ecologically speaking, this used to be all dominated by wetlands. Tends to have very organic, rich, peaty soils, and it's a system that would sequester a lot of carbon in the soils.
The Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula has a history of large-scale commercial agriculture. Vast tracts of land that are used for corn, soybean, crops like that.
Really pretty late in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, huge parts of the coastal plain, forested wetlands were drained with sort of mechanized drainage systems, canals, ditches, etc., to pump water off and keep them dry enough to farm.
No matter where you go on the peninsula, you can see some type of artificial drainage infrastructure.
You can even use Google Earth and Google Maps, and you can see some of these changes, on your computer.
Even though they were made to drain water from the interior out to the estuary, there's the potential for them to serve the opposite purpose. You can have storms that push salt water deep into the interior, often through ditches and drains that may not have flow control structures or other protective measures.
Now when you have a drought, the sounds get saltier, in part because they're evaporating and in part because they're not getting fresh water off the landscape. So you start to see those salts mixing up.
You could actually have gradients of salt water that penetrate deep into the interior through these ditches and drains. One of the impacts of climate change is a likely increase in the number and severity of droughts and the intensity of storms. In both of those cases, we're actually influencing different types of saltwater intrusions.
The thing that's actually happening is that salt is getting into a landscape and killing individual organisms, be they trees or microbes. So it's actually happening at a very granular scale. But what we want to know, and I think what most people want to know, is how the coast of North Carolina is going to change as a result of saltwater intrusion. Our team is a hydrologist, 2 biogeochemists, a plant ecologist, and a social scientist, all trying to think about how can we bring our expertise to bear in this really multi-layered, difficult question.
We're collecting data from more than a dozen sites around the peninsula.
So we measure the water chemistry, we measure the water level, nutrients are there, how much salt is in there. We also monitor the soils, the chemistry of the soil. We look at the greenhouse gas emissions. And then we've also started measuring greenhouse gases from trees. Is the tree functioning like a chimney? So is it taking gases that are being produced by microbes in the soil and releasing them out into the atmosphere? Or is it more like a cork, and is it actually helping to keep gases that the microbes are producing in the soil within the soil?
All of these things are monitored continuously at a handful of sites around the peninsula, but we also have handheld tools that we can use to make spot checks as we drive around broadly.
What we would really like to do is link what we're seeing with vegetation, areas where we know there's saltwater intrusion occurring, to what we're seeing in the soil. So yes, there's salinization here. This is what the trees do when that happens. We really wanted to have a little bit more control, and if you want to have control as a scientist, what you do is an experiment. So we're adding salt alone and salt with nutrients and nutrients alone, and we're trying to understand if we keep doing that, what happens? Do the leaves seem stressed? Are they water stressed? If we can start to see those things from space, we could detect saltwater stress at a much larger scale.
Using geospatial data, we can try to see if what we see in these small places are going to apply to much larger areas.
We're currently using digital elevation models to assess how vulnerable the landscape is to saltwater intrusion. We're using these algorithms that tell us how water concentrates and flows across the surface and how connected or disconnected different parts of the landscape are to one another, combining those metrics in ways that allow us to come up with an estimate of vulnerability. And when I look at those maps, I get a sense of the magnitude of this problem. Some of those salts can stay behind in the soils, so you may see reduced yields in crops, and there are forests nearby. That could be one of the factors that leads them to become ghost forests. We think that ghost forests are spreading throughout the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula and throughout many parts of the eastern U.S. The pace of sea level rise and the intensity of human modification of the landscape have accelerated that process. I've never worked on a project where the change is happening at such a rapid timescale.
It is possible that we might not fully understand this problem before it's too late. So this area is actually one of the highest sea level rise rates in the country.
You could be very fatalistic and say, just let it go underwater. And I think that would be unfortunate if that's the decision that we make. There's the enormous standing stock of carbon in the trees and the soils of all these coastal wetlands that could be lost back to the atmosphere. And then there's the biodiversity loss. If we lose these so fast, we're just going to lose this really important ecoregion. Where we can be hopeful is that there are a lot of things that we could do to manage this landscape differently than just abandoning it to the sea.
One of the things we hope to do with our research is to provide decision makers with tools that they can use to potentially mitigate some of the effects of saltwater intrusion that are caused by ditches and drains.
Rather than it being an on or off switch where it has to be either we build a ditch or we plug it, can we find ways where we allow water to move in one direction but not maybe allow it to move in another direction, or even maybe trying to figure out if there are maybe crops that would be more salt tolerant that are growing out here. And the same thing for these wetlands. So restoring it to what used to be here historically is probably not going to be the smartest idea. And starting to think about what species are going to do well, can we use those species for restoration? If you have ecological collapse, you're going to have agricultural collapse. But I tend to be an optimistic person, and so I hope that people that are making the decisions to make changes are going to hear what we have to say.
If we do nothing and we continue to farm, we continue to build infrastructure as if these forests and these systems are not going to change, then we might be in for some really rotten surprises in a few decades.
I think humans can have a huge impact on both whether new ghost forests develop, whether current ghost forests expand, and also what happens now once a ghost forest exists on the landscape. Do we leave them? Could we manage them in a way that we might actually move more rapidly into a sort of a salt marsh ecosystem? I think there's a lot of interesting decisions that we could begin to make. They're not going to be forests in those places probably again, but they might be something equally interesting and beautiful. Thanks for humoring me. I think Luke Groskin did an amazing job, and he took more than 30 hours of film to make that 10-minute film. So we sounded way smarter than we actually are because he was a good editor. But I wanted to say before I moved on to Josh's questions that since that short film was made about 4 years ago, we've been doing a lot of work to expand our view of this impact beyond coastal North Carolina. And I was delighted to see in the chat that Elliot White is here with us today. And so I wanted to advertise a paper that Elliot led with myself and Ji Yang and my former PhD student, Emily Urey. It came out last year, where Elliot worked to look at how much coastal forested wetland have we lost across the entire North American coastal plain. And that was a sobering report, and that he found that more than 8% of coastal forested wetlands have been lost just between the years of 1996 and 2016. And it's really interesting because this is all happening really after a lot of the wetland protection acts have been passed and put in place. And what we found is that the losses that were happening in this last 20-year period were much less to agricultural development, which is what has been the threats to coastal wetlands in the past, and much more to a transition into sort of shrubby, scrubby habitat, which is what we typically see following saltwater intrusion or flooding from sea level rise. And it's not just, widespread mortality like you see in a really obvious ghost forest, but if you look in conservation areas, what Emily and Elliot found, you're seeing pretty rapid fragmentation. So this is just zooming in on a single preserve area in the same part of coastal North Carolina where we know that the site really well. The top figure is going to show you the forest cover in green in 1996 and the same area in 2017. This is in a protected area in which you can see all the gray is the loss of tree cover. And it's not just on the edge where you're like touching the sound. It's along the canals. You see these linear features of dying forest. And we're really having what I kind of think of as an unraveling of these coastal forested wetlands, even in areas where we're protecting them. So our conservation boundaries are good at protecting them from loss to agriculture in the future, but they're not doing a very good job at protecting these forests from climate change. And of course, this is a new and increasingly severe threat that we have to be cognizant of. And then the other piece of the work that we're expanding into is that a number of us have just gotten funded a new National Science Foundation Research Coordination Network to pull together people studying this problem of rural coastal climate change from across the entire North American coastal plain. And we're linking the environmental science side with the social science side, because what you're seeing in a lot of these landscapes, we're looking at forests, and it's because we can see them from space, but the same places where we're seeing forest loss, we're seeing loss of agricultural productivity, whole-scale loss of agricultural fields to salinization, threats to drinking water supplies. And so the landscapes where this is happening, a lot of the focus on coastal change is on the wealthy fringe where the people have big houses. We think there needs to be a lot more attention in the much poorer, lower, less empowered communities who are living in rural landscapes. So this is just showing you on the top, the redder it is, the more likely the landscape is to have a flood hazard, to basically be vulnerable to hurricane or drought-induced salinization. And the bottom set of graphs, the more purple you are, the higher the poverty level of the populations living in those places. And a lot of the places which are really vulnerable to rapid climate change on the coast also happen to be places where the people who live there are already living on the edge. And so this is going to be something that's a real threat. So there's an enormous environmental justice component to this story as well, that it's going to be an important part of our work moving forward. And with that, I'm really looking forward to now initiating a conversation with Josh where we can get into some of the questions that those of you in the audience want to talk about. So let me stop sharing my screen, right, Josh?
Yep, that'd be great, Emily. Thank you.
Let me see if I can.
So while you're doing that, let me just ask the first question while you're there. We go. It's fascinating. I mean, somebody said, is the definition of a ghost forest saltwater intrusion that then kills the trees? And I think that was a good summary. But we lose so much more. And I want to talk about that, but I also just want to start, how does a scientist get involved with studying and researching ghost forests? I mean, it's intellectually interesting post hoc, but what led you there?
I think I'm from the Gene Likens. So Gene Likens is my advisor. I'm from the school that you make observations in the field and those tell you what the questions are that you should ask. And so this was literally a question that you could not avoid asking. Like we said in the film, we were working in this big giant restoration project. We were really interested in understanding if you convert a farm field back into a coastal wetland, how much carbon gets stored, how much biodiversity comes back. And then we had this drought and this mass mortality event of a lot of the trees that had been intentionally planted as part of this restoration. And that was quite an aha moment, because okay, you're restoring is going back to the past in a landscape that is very clearly heading like at hyperspeed into a new climate future. And so is this going to work? And right around the same time, that drought, were really the double whammy of that 3 years of drought punctuated by a massive hurricane, led to a huge amount of ghost forest expansion all over the coast of North Carolina. So if you were driving around, you started to see them everywhere and people were starting to report them. And so this is literally one of those questions that smacks you in the face, right? That you can't really be down there thinking about this, how do we restore a system, when the really important question seems to be, what's the future going to be? And how do we move into it? Your point about it happening in protected areas, right? So even in protected areas, you're losing forest because of a saltwater intrusion and this change. And I love your description of how you decide things. I remember when I started my PhD, a good friend of mine who's a postdoc said, remember to look at the animals first.
right? And don't collect any data, just look. And I think that's great advice to the scientists and the young scientists, particularly on this webinar. You know, the sea level rise combined with storms, combined with saltwater intrusion as a result, is turning the wetlands into salt marshes, right? I mean, they used to be brackish and things. And you know, salt marshes are beautiful. They're productive in their own way. They too store some carbon, but why is it a problem that we're losing the wetlands and gaining salt marsh?
So a lot of people ask, well, okay, it's just one kind of wetland converting to another. And of course, salt marshes are super valuable ecosystem. I wonder if we could put up that slide that just has a nice picture of a coastal forested wetland versus a salt marsh. But there's a couple reasons that it really matters. The most important of which is over geologic time, glacial, interglacial cycles, as sea levels rise and fall, you would have had this progression, everything migrates down as the sea levels falls and everything migrates up as the sea levels rise. But what's really different about what's happening now is the pace of sea level rise is so much faster than any time in our geologic past. And B, the uplands are covered in farms and cities and roads and suburbs. So where can these coastal forested wetlands go? They would have to move really fast, and they would have to jump over massive areas that are being intentionally managed to keep them out. So the salt marsh, it does seem that you are seeing a lot of salt marsh migration. And unfortunately, that's squeezing your sort of forested coastal systems into extinction.
So Emily, I'm going to just say, if people look, there's a small picture. Leslie, can you highlight that upper picture with the beautiful cypress forest, which has trees and it has structure? There we go. Yeah. It has structure, and the salt marsh, which is stunningly beautiful in its own way, but it lacks all the complexity of the forest and the layering, which is important for biodiversity, important for carbon storage, and important for a lot of things. Is that a good?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, obviously they're both amazing. I love salt marshes as well. Like, I'm an ecologist because I love salt marshes, and they're fabulous nursery habitat. They do a lot. I mean, they're really important, of course. So we're not sort of making a value comparison. It's more, let's think about that beautiful cypress swamp on the top there. That's holding more than twice as much carbon as the salt marsh.
I was going to ask what the carbon implications were for this, right?
And a lot of that carbon is distributed in these beautiful trees, right, which are home to all kinds of animals that live only in this kind of habitat. So you also have this really important biodiversity component that's quite unique compared to a salt marsh. So we need both. I would really hate to lose these. And Elliott's projections from his paper are that if we continue losing these at the pace we've done over the last 20 years, they will be essentially extinct as a habitat by the end of the century. And that, I think, would be such a shame for so many reasons.
And so there's the problem of loss of diversity, there's loss of structure, there's loss of an increasingly rare habitat. There were some pictures of coastlines and a discussion that some of those coastlines were more vulnerable than others. And let me see if Leslie can jump forward to that slide. One more, Leslie, over there we go. And I was wondering, why is it? What makes certain areas on the coastline so much more vulnerable and have to have that big red blob you showed, as opposed to others where the very thin little red strip? And is that related to what are the factors that's related to?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things. First, one of the most important is how rapidly is the sea level rising on the coastline, because that does vary across the North American coastal plain. As you heard in the video, North Carolina has one of the most rapid rates. The other is, do you have protection from the sea through, say, an Outer Banks, right? So actually the Pamlico and Albemarle Sounds are less salty than the open ocean, right? So, and then in South Carolina, that's the open ocean hitting those wetlands. So how salty is it? How rapidly is the sea level rising? So that's kind of the stressor, the source of the stressor. And then you have the shape of the landscape that is receiving that, right? So if one of the places, the thing that makes Southern Louisiana and the Carolinas big bullseyes on that, flood risk map is that they have these massive, super flat coastal plain landscapes where it just goes on for miles and miles and miles and miles. And so you just don't have a lot of topographic relief. And then the third piece of that is, what have people done to either armor the edge, right, which you see across much of the Northeast, or basically penetrate that edge with a whole lot of hydrological infrastructure like you see in places where there's all this agricultural drainage. So it's a complex problem, right? It's both how strong is the signal that's causing the change, what's the shape of the landscape receiving that, and then what are we doing to actively resist or enable that change?
Right, right. And so if you have a mountain that comes down to a flat plain, then the water comes up to that mountain, has nowhere to go.
Right.
And if it's like that, instead it comes creeping up, but the land above it then becomes potential new new habitat.
Right.
And I think for those of us in the Northeast, we think about the Hudson River and Stuart Finlay's work and some work Scenic Hudson did, which shows that as the water rises on the Hudson, which it does because it's an estuary and it has salt water underneath and fresh on the top, it pushes out into the marshes. And then you have it's a rift, like the Rift Valley. It's an old opening of the continent, and it's very, very steep. And so there's nowhere to go.
There's nowhere to go.
Marshes can't migrate. And so that's a real problem. There's another problem I want to ask you about. It's not just the marshes that can't migrate. You mentioned the social justice piece of this. And, what is how is agriculture, people in the Northeast think of coasts as places like the Hamptons where it's $1 million an acre, but how does the agriculture and poverty and environmental justice sort of in North Carolina, all link up to sort of amplify this problem in realms that are not just ecological?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you have a lot of people in the coastal plain of North Carolina that don't want to talk about climate change, but are perfectly happy to talk to you about field flooding and salinization of their fields. And so it's a big problem. It's widely acknowledged. Everybody either has it happening on their land or knows someone who is. And I think it's probably been best studied so far up in the Delmarva Peninsula. There's a really good group of folks working up there where you're seeing some pretty active movement by farmers to start growing salt tolerant crops. So that's one, adaptation farmers can do. In the coastal plain of North Carolina, we're seeing less of that. I think a lot of that's because we have a lot of farms that were built by big multinational companies and are rented out to basically rental farmers who are operating pretty small individual areas. They're really riding the line in terms of what their personal home economies. And so I think that's an interesting difference regionally, but you've got sort of different farming communities facing this problem, and the amount of economic or socioeconomic power they have to make change or to protect their fields really varies. And that's one thing we're going to be spending a lot of time thinking about with our new research coordinating network.
All right. Usually this is a new format for us, and Emily and I would go on, but we've got 20 more minutes and we got a bunch of great questions.
Good.
One question is, are there other places in the world where expansion of ghost forests is being observed? We know the ocean rises, and it doesn't rise in the Northeast or the East Coast of the United States. So are we seeing the same phenomenon globally? And you mentioned the research network that you're building. Is that international? Is it national? Is it both?
Yeah, so the research coordinating network, we're focusing on the North American coastal plain. We felt like that was a big enough bite to take on at the beginning. But I will say again, Elliot's on this meeting, but he just like an hour ago sent a new analysis of some of the Ramsar wetlands from around the world, where we're trying to basically apply the same approaches that we use for the North American coastal plain to look at woody wetlands in coastal areas globally. And for sure, that early set of data is showing that, yes, this is happening all over the place. I think the next questions that will be very interesting is, how do different regions of the world that do and don't have different hydrologic management or different armoring of their coasts, how is that making them more or less vulnerable? I think that's a really interesting question. You may have places with less coastal development that are actually far less vulnerable to this change than places like the East and Gulf Coast of North America, where we've actually manipulated these systems in such an extreme way.
Right, and sort of global to local, that explains one of the questions was saying, don't we have this in the Harlem Valley? And the answer is yep. Right, it's happening anywhere you have relatively flat land.
Yeah.
You have a rising sea level, and then Superstorm Sandy and Irene up here just amplified that. And so you really don't want those storms happening with northeasters on a high tide, right?
Right.
So,
Well, and don't forget droughts, because it also happens with droughts. So it's really an interesting problem. It's a little bit hard to wrap your brain around, right? That
because it's wet, wet and dry, dry.
yeah, exactly.
Because then you get the intrusion because the fresh water isn't coming out, so the salt water comes in further.
Right.
Is that what happens in a drought?
The drought is just that so much of what keeps the sea at bay is the fresh water coming off the super flat landscape. And when that stops happening, you can basically have wind mixing those salts back up. So a lot of the coastal plain in North Carolina, pretty far in the interior, it doesn't have like lunar tides, it has wind tides. So when the wind blows in towards the land, it pushes water masses up.
It's so flat. Right.
It's so flat. Yeah.
It's so flat. All right. Another question that came up is, how do one of the things we increasingly see in ecosystem science and ecology more general is increasing scale of study, but also the marvelous technologies that are coming online that allow us to study this and maybe remediate this faster and better because we understand it better. How do you use technology to answer some of these questions? What are the new technologies that are tracking the expansion of ghost forests?
Well, for sure. I mean, the fact that so much of this change has been happening during the era of remote sensing and satellite imagery makes it something that we can actually see really well at every scale over the last 30 years. I think what's exciting is there are lots of new technologies coming out that are going to make it, I mean, we can actually see individual trees. We can look at things like drought stress. We can start to actually, and that's something that, a lot of us are actively engaged in doing, is can we actually start to detect early warning signals? Again, using coastal forested wetland trees as a canary in the coal mine. Are we seeing places where, we didn't know that was an issue there? Because it's very hard to model the movement of salt in super flat landscapes. Hydrologists do not enjoy that, right? And so we may need to use the vegetation to tell us what this chemical signal is doing.
Right, because you to date we can't do refractometry from the satellites to see whether there's more or less salt. Somebody asked, and this was a question I had earlier, so I'm going to ask it. Can you comment a little bit about the Chesapeake, because it has sort of similarities of being a big basin of water and salt water and get brackish up higher, and it's quite flat around it. Do they have the same issues?
They absolutely do. They absolutely do. There's a lot,
right?
Yep, there's a lot of work happening on this issue throughout the Chesapeake and the Delmarva Peninsula. So yes, it's absolutely an issue throughout the Chesapeake. I think one reason why it doesn't show up as a hot spot on Elliott's map is it also is much more developed. And so we actually have one of the things that makes a place a hot spot for the loss of coastal forested wetlands is that you have coastal forested wetlands to lose, right? So in a lot of places on the East Coast, we've actually already lost so much, there's not as much to lose. I think that is a bit of an issue for why the Chesapeake Bay doesn't show up as a hotspot. Where those forests still exist, they are absolutely undergoing this kind of problem.
Right, so it's a series of insults.
Yes.
And you start with the first insult of deforestation. And then where you don't deforest, right? And I'm sure I remember some arguments for dams in Southeast Asia. Well, the forests are going to die anyway, and so we'll put up a dam. And I hate to think what people are arguing for preemptive harvest in areas that are being inundated. Well, and that gets to the next question. Can you expand or elaborate a little bit on this idea of saltwater intrusion moving through the subsurface, and also how human development interacts with that? And maybe somebody asks, is it just, can we just block off the canals we've dug and all that? What's the interplay between subsurface movement of saltier water and human development?
Oh God, I mean, that is just, I wish I knew. I mean, and I think that's again, a huge challenge. So even in the community of people studying this, there's a lot of people who think that intrusion should only be used for groundwater movement of salt. And that definitely happens in some places more than others. I will say in our work in the coastal plain of North Carolina, that big restoration site, we're seeing saltwater intrusion. It's completely fresh, 1 meter below the surface. So that there is a totally a surface water phenomenon. And that's going to be true in some places. In other places, particularly where they're extracting a lot of water, you may be drawing salt water in and starting to actually irrigate with salt water. And so you may see that it's purely a groundwater problem. And of course, there's going to be other places where it's yes, and it's both of those things. So again, another thorny part of this is that it's not just knowing how water is moving, it's knowing how salt is moving. And that's actually, it's really complicated. So I suspect you're going to have areas that have dominated by a groundwater signal, dominated by a surface water signal, and somewhere it's both.
Okay. There was a question that I think has a fairly straightforward answer, but I assume that if you're in the barrier islands of North Carolina, and South Carolina and further north, the barrier islands just get hammered immediately because they're the first row of saltwater intrusion. Or do the barrier islands have greater altitude and it's much more patchy?
I think you tend to see, well, at least on the North Carolina, our very skinny North Carolina barrier islands, we've got beaches, we've got dune maritime forest, and then we've got salt marsh. We don't really have coastal forested wetlands in many of our barrier islands. They're too thin to like hold on to that.
And very sandy, right? So they don't have very good soil. So, all right. One question that I think we covered a little bit, but maybe you could amplify is the the relationship between all this and carbon cycles, not just carbon storage, but carbon cycles.
So that's something we've been working on for a long time. It's actually one of the reasons we need to have this research coordination network, because people are actually finding different things. One thing we can tell you for sure is that coastal forested wetlands store literally tons and tons of carbon, and salt marshes store fewer tons. What happens during that transition is still very poorly understood. What happens to all that carbon? Marcelo, Ardon, and I have been talking about this burp in this transition period, right? You can imagine that you've got in a ghost forest, what's happening, right? You should be having a lot of emissions of CO2. You may or may not have high emissions of methane. The fact that a lot of these areas are in agriculturally dominated landscapes, often with consolidated animal feeding operations, means that they often have really high nitrogen loads too. So nitrous oxide is also a component of this. So I think the greenhouse gas part of this, we have done a lot of work on that. I would say I don't feel comfortable saying that there is a clear answer except for CO2.
Okay.
And that is one of the things that people find very different trajectories in different places we study this problem.
Well, and that is both the joy and the frustration of science.
That's the classic ecology answer that I teach to all my ecology students. It depends. It's almost always the right answer. Right. And in this case, we don't have the right answer. We don't know what that answer is yet.
And I'm going to put a little plug in for funding science. Right.
I think that would be great.
So let me be really cynical. I'm going to take a question we got. We asked people to put questions in on registration. And there's a question that I think is sort of going through everybody's head. Isn't this just inevitable? Right? Is this a natural process, that's sort of occurring over many decades? And why are we so worried about it?
I guess the migration of coastal wetlands is for sure a natural process. We have accelerated that process at a rate not seen before by the organisms that are having to deal with it. So the fossil fuel combustion and climate change has made it so the rate of sea level rise, the intensity of hurricanes, the duration and magnitude of droughts are making this problem move faster than most of these species are capable of escaping. Right. So trees move slow. They have to, and then we've also fragmented the landscape in a way that makes it much harder for them to move or harden that landscape. And so, yes, the processes are all things that have been happening forever on this planet. However, the obstacle course in which it's having to happen and the speed at which they have to play the game is really, really fundamentally different. Right.
So in the geological record, a lot of these changes happen over hundreds or thousands of years. Right. And then you don't have people around to mess up the recovery, right? So we have changed, we have altered the landscape. And that sort of, you mentioned a couple things here, but I was particularly struck by, excuse me, your comment that people are deeply knowledgeable and aware of ghost forests and saltwater intrusion and don't believe in climate change. Not that it's a thought, that it's a belief system that one can or can't believe in, but they're unwilling to acknowledge human-driven climate change. So I think it's really great. In a way, we need to get past us saying climate change, climate change, climate change. We have to talk to people about the things that matter to them where they live, because that will help us perhaps convince them that we need to change. I'm wondering, what are some potential practices that communities can be considering to help adapt to these changing conditions in the coastal forests?
Yeah, just to follow up on that one point, I do think you don't have to agree with one another about how you feel about climate change to have a conversation with anybody about saltwater intrusions and rising water and flooding, right? So that's actually kind of convenient. You can just bypass that philosophical political debate because we can just go straight into the problem that you could see on the ground. So that is in some ways an advantage in building bigger coalitions. I think we have to find ways to compensate the people who could be asked to convert large areas of landscape from what they currently are, which is largely agricultural, into a landscape that might actually be, intentionally and gracefully managed to allow for climate adaptation. And I think there's so many options for technical solutions where you can literally go in and actually make it so canals only flow out, they don't flow in, flap gates, et cetera. So there's places where that kind of technical innovation might be really protective of large areas of landscape. We're going to need to accompany that with some probably assisted migration of these trees. And there's a reason to do that, not just because I love trees and I am a tree hugger, but the protection that these wetland complexes provide to people and our livelihoods and our homes from storm surges and from salinization are incredibly important. And I think if we don't do anything intelligent here, we just keep letting this happen, we're going to lose our coastal wetlands. We're going to salinize huge areas of agricultural land so that they are no longer sort of viable for that livelihood. Those salts are going to extract legacy fertilizers from all of those farm fields, and that's going to further, and we've seen this is going to cause massive issues for coastal fisheries and coastal water quality. And so, there's sort of like the business as usual plan of not thinking about what to do about this problem is definitely leading us in a direction that is really unpleasant. I think we can make it far more graceful if we start thinking about sort of adaptive management of these landscapes, and also not right now. There is a lot of money going into wetland restoration as one of the things that we might do, and that's great. But we can't be looking to the past in what we choose to do with those wetlands when they're facing something that those past wetlands never faced. And so there's a lot of reworking that needs to be done in the policy and management arena to make that a little smarter moving forward.
Your comment earlier about this all started because you were restoring coastal forests, pushing water uphill, sorry, no pun intended, is not going to work. Earlier when we were talking before the webinar, you mentioned that the people who are farming this land often are farming on land that they lease from the state or the feds.
From multinational corporations.
Oh, so it's from they're leasing the land.
Yeah.
They tend to be poorer people. This is not wildly wealthy farmers with massive properties entirely. And so there's a justice issue here as well. So we're assisting in the migration of trees, but we also have to think about adapting for humans. And in Elizabeth Rush's book, we had a in real life Friday night with Elizabeth just before the pandemic, but her book Rising, right, which won a Pulitzer, is really, I think quite a good compliment, right, on the human side of these rising sea levels for what it does to coastal communities, human communities. So we're going to do something again slightly different. For those of you who have questions that are unanswered, there are always unanswered questions in our Q&A as there are in life. And Emily has kindly said she's going to sort of group them together afterwards and write a few answers for people who didn't get their questions answered. Probably less likely if it was a hyper-local question, and we apologize for that in advance. But I asked Emily, rather than doing, because we didn't do the sort of longer Josh and Emily talk, we had the movie, we had some preamble. I'd like you to close, with a really sort of straightforward discussion of what can be done. And so, Leslie, could we highlight the what could be done slide that you popped up? I see that. And Emily, could you talk a little bit about, let's end on a positive note of things that people can do to try and help make this better. You mentioned assisted migration of plants and probably animals as well, where we actually move things around because they can't move fast enough themselves. But what other things can we do?
Okay, so let me I'm going to zero in on coastal forested wetlands, but then come back out to thinking about much larger socioecological problems in these landscapes. If we want to save this iconic and special habitat that provides all kinds of ecosystem services and is culturally and spiritually important to many people, then we need to actually figure out what part of the remaining coastal forested wetlands are we going to be best able to protect, and what is it going to take to protect them. And it's probably going to be a combination of water management, assisted migration, the purchase of land that enables that migration. It's going to be a lot of things. We need to make sure that when we do that, so in this landscape we're looking at now, again, this is coastal North Carolina. Let's say we're buying land or putting land into easements, and that's benefiting the owner of the land, but it's not benefiting the leasing farmer, right? We've got to figure out a way to actually make it so that there is a livelihood attached to this that is an attractive alternative. Now, when I look at this landscape, if you go into that NOAA sea level rise viewer and you put in the expected sea level rise for the next century, half of this landscape is going to be underwater in 100 years. And so, what's more important than really anything is thinking about where are these people as well as these ecosystems going to go, and how are we going to create really assisted migration for a whole ecosystem inclusive of the people, right? That's going to be thoughtful and intentional, and it's going to require, yes, some science, but I think more than anything, sort of recognition that this problem is here. It's intense, it's accelerating, and that the people who are sort of facing it head on right now have a really limited voice. So I think part of what we need to do as scientists is make sure we expand that conversation to include the people whose voices really should be heard instead of ours. So I hope that, within 3 years with this coordination network, we're coordinating with stakeholders. I hope that we can help amplify those voices and those stories of why it matters that we keep these kinds of communities of plants and animals and people existing and healthy. And that's still kind of a philosophical answer, Josh. Of course, it's not going to be simple because it's one of those wicked problems. But I think the first thing is to get our act together, right? And tell those stories. Yeah.
Well, and there are engineering and water control things we can do. But I think your critical insight is we have to acknowledge this. We can't pretend it isn't happening. We have to acknowledge it's happening faster. And we have to help the people who are suffering the most from this, as well as the plants and animals that are suffering the most.
And maybe I'll say, so much of the energy and focus and news articles and federal money on this issue is going to help people maintain extremely expensive homes on the edge. And we need to put some of that energy into the interior where it could go a lot farther.
Yeah. Well, look, we are at 7:59. I will say, Dr. Bernhardt, it was a pleasure. As it always is, our conversations are never dull, but this one was particularly interesting, and I'm so glad. I'm so sorry we couldn't do this in the Thomas E. Lovejoy III Auditorium at Cary Institute. I hope someday, because you have so many research interests, we will invite you back for another lecture in the auditorium. For people who are worried that if we go in real life, we're going to lose you, don't worry. We are investing in our auditorium, so it will be good for streaming. We can do hybrid lectures. But Emily, thank you so much. That was spectacular. To the audience, we will be sending everybody who registered, and we had over 195 people at our peak today, almost 200 people, which on a Friday night, on a beautiful June Friday night, is impressive. But we will be sending out the link, and I would urge you, forward the link to family and friends. Let them know what's happening, particularly if you know people who live near the coast in the United States or overseas. This is an important issue, and we feel that this webinar will live on, and we really appreciate everything you do for us. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. And Emily, thank you for your great work. Thank you for being a trustee, and thank you for being so willing to communicate to the public the serious nature of these challenges.
Well, thanks to everybody for giving up an hour of your life for a challenging conversation, and thanks to the Cary folks and to Josh for the invitation. I appreciate it.
So good night, everyone. It is now 8:01 and we're a minute over, but I think it was worth it. Have a great weekend.